Those who have traveled to the USA, what's your what the hell America experience? Story 1. I was at a restaurant in LA with a friend, sitting in one of those cozy booths. Right behind us, there were two young women, probably in their early 20s, who looked stunning. Their conversation, though, was what really caught our attention. They spoke in that heavy Valley Girl accent, the kind that's both hilarious and slightly over the top. At first, they were chatting about the adult film industry and a producer who had called them for a shoot. Naturally, their topic piqued our interest, so we couldn't help but listen in. At one point, one of the girls asked the other what her porn name was. She replied with some generic name, though I can't recall it now. Their conversation shifted after a while, and I overheard the word India, which made me tune in more closely. They started talking about how Indians eat with their hands and how gross they found it. I could see why some Americans might think that way, but what came next was pure irony. Curious, my friend decided to Google the girl's porn name, and, well, let's just say the first image that popped up was of her licking some guy's posterior. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Everyone's got their thing, but it was hard not to notice the hypocrisy when just moments earlier, she was criticizing eating with hands. The second photo was even more outrageous. It showed her surrounded by 4 men, involved in an explicit scene. At that point, my friend and I just exchanged looks of disbelief. I mean, really, how can you call eating with your hands gross and then turn around and do that? Honestly, the whole thing left us shaking our heads. But hey, if there's one thing Americans do, it's follow rules. For example, traffic stops at a stop sign. It's just a cultural norm. Go figure. Story 2. About 8 years ago, I was in Florida visiting a mall, one of those places with a circular atrium near a store. I think it was Simon or something similar. As a non-American, one thing I'd never seen with my own eyes until that trip were those fat people scooters. Over here, scooters are typically used by the elderly or people with significant disabilities, and they tend to be smaller. But in Florida, they were everywhere. In the circular area of the mall, where foot traffic got pretty tight because people were moving in both directions, I was hanging out while the group I was with went into a store I wasn't interested in. It was a clothing store, but the specifics don't matter. What does matter is what I saw while people watching. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted what I assume was a family, around 5 of them, all riding these scooters. They were spread out in a line, sunglasses on, hats pulled low, and honestly, they looked like some kind of scooter gang. They were taking up so much space that people had to awkwardly maneuver around them, which wasn't Then, from the other direction, another group on scooters appeared. This second family had one standout member, a teenage girl, probably around 15, walking alongside them. She was relatively slim and moving under her own power, which immediately caught my attention. What made the scene even more fascinating was when this second group saw the first one. They stopped in their tracks, leading to a mini traffic jam in the mall. It felt like a Western showdown, except instead of cowboys, it was 2 families on scooters facing off. For a solid 20 seconds, they just stared at each other. No one else seemed to care. They just walked around them as if the standoff was perfectly normal. I, on the other hand, couldn't look away. The suspense was real. Finally, the alpha female of the first family, her forehead so layered with fat it drooped over her eyes, yelled something unintelligible to her clan. They all hit the gas, or whatever scooters use, and charged forward at top speed, which, to be honest, wasn't very fast. They collided with the second family in a chaotic crash that sent one of the first family's men tumbling off his scooter. He flailed on the ground like a turtle on its back, unable to right himself. That's when things escalated. The second family's beta female started screaming at the alpha of the first group, and before long, it turned into an all-out brawl. People were throwing shopping bags, and even snacks. At one point, someone hurled a giant bag of orange crisps, which exploded on impact, sending chips flying everywhere. Mall cops eventually arrived to break up the chaos, though one of them looked like he could have used a scooter himself. The families were escorted off in opposite directions, and the whole scene came to an anticlimactic end. Even now, 3 things stick with me. First, the teenage girl from the second family, who just backed into a corner looking utterly mortified while her family played bumper cars. Second, my regret at not having a camera with me. Who would have thought such a spectacle would unfold at a random mall? And finally, that was the day I realized people could store fat on their foreheads. Who knew? Story 3. A few years ago, my family and I went on a trip to California from the UK. We visited Disney, and what started as a magical day took a turn when my daughter fell and hit her head, splitting her ear open. The first aid responders at the park patched her up as best they could, but it was clear she needed stitches. Instead of directing us to a specific hospital, they handed us a map with a dozen hospitals marked on it and told us to pick one, saying they didn't want to advertise any particular hospital. We picked a hospital randomly, but unfortunately, it turned out to be the wrong choice. When we got there, they refused to book her in at AE until they could contact our travel insurance, or we agreed to pay up front. That in itself was unsettling. While I was wrestling with the paperwork, I noticed a mentally disturbed man repeatedly trying to enter the hospital. The staff completely ignored him, and when he got too close to the front desk, security would escort him back outside and sit him on a bench like it was routine. When we finally got onto the ward, the experience didn't get much better. There was a sedated man handcuffed to a wheelchair in the next bay over. What made it especially disturbing was the complete lack of privacy. There were no screens or curtains separating the patients. Worse, his hospital gown had ridden up, leaving his private parts fully exposed for everyone to see. It was one of the strangest and most uncomfortable experiences I've had in a medical facility. Story 3. Of all the times I've been to the US, there's only been one occasion where I got genuinely annoyed at an American. This happened in a visitor center in Australia, AUS. My friend and I were waiting for a tour to begin, and we were chatting with some people in the center. It was the usual friendly exchange. Where are you from? Oh, England. What part of England? The kind of small talk you expect. However, there was this one guy who couldn't seem to help himself. Every time I spoke, he'd interrupt with a terrible attempt at mimicking my accent and throw out random phrases like, "Bloody England," or "What's a wanker?" He'd laugh at his own jokes, expecting everyone else to find him funny, but the room grew visibly uncomfortable. I decided to excuse myself and head to the restroom, hoping he'd stop. To my dismay, he followed me. As I entered the cubicle, I heard him playing the UK national anthem on his phone. He even waited outside the stall and asked, "Did you like it?" when I came out. Thankfully, our tour started at that moment, and he wasn't part of it. As if that wasn't bizarre enough, on our way out of the visitor center, I witnessed someone getting arrested at gunpoint for refusing to accept a jaywalking ticket. Where I'm from, jaywalking is just crossing the road, but apparently, in some states, it's a serious offense. It was quite the eye-opener about cultural differences. Story 4. I'm American, but I've lived in the UK for most of my life. On one of my annual visits back to the States to see family, I stopped at a Starbucks on the NJ Turnpike. I asked for a white coffee, please, and immediately, I could feel the tension. The barista gave me the strangest look, and when I repeated myself, I realized I must have said something wrong. It dawned on me later that what I meant, coffee with milk, isn't called that in the US. I think the barista assumed I was asking for a coffee for white people, which, understandably, offended him. Eventually, we sorted it out, but it was a mistake I never repeated. Another time, I was in a Walmart and asked an employee, "Where are the toilets?" She responded, "I'm sorry, ma'am. We don't sell those here." Confused, I clarified that I wasn't looking to buy one, but she suggested I check Home Depot if I changed my mind. At that moment, I couldn't think of other terms for toilet that wouldn't complicate things further, so I gave up and wandered the store until I found the restroom myself. Later, when I told my mom about it, she was mortified. Apparently, saying toilet in America is as rude as asking for the crapper. Who knew? She gave me a quick rundown of acceptable alternatives: ladies' room, powder room, and restroom. I chalked it up to another quirky cultural difference. Also, I was amazed that Walmart didn't sell toilets. For a store where you can buy everything from milk to guns, that seemed oddly specific. Story 5. Having relatives in New York, my family and I worked hard to save enough money for a trip to visit them. This was going to be the trip of a lifetime because, for us, traveling to the US isn't cheap. Before we went, we were heavily influenced by the negative stereotypes we'd seen in the media. Police shootings, mass shootings, corruption, and so on. Honestly, we were expecting the worst. Ignorant, violent, racist, and self-absorbed people. But I couldn't have been more wrong. Everywhere we went, people were incredibly kind. Strangers on the street helped us find our way, pointed us to the nearest subway station, and even took the time to recommend the best, most affordable restaurants and shops, all with genuine smiles. Even the police were incredibly polite. We must have approached them dozens of times for directions, and they always answered patiently and kindly. I've traveled to 3 of the wealthiest countries in Europe, and I have to admit, people there were nowhere near as polite or helpful as Americans. In fact, they were often rude and dismissive. This trip taught me a valuable lesson about not judging an entire nation based on what you see in the media. My family and I left with nothing but good memories of our stay, and to this day, I have a newfound respect for the American people. Story 6. When I was about 16 or 17, a friend and I were strolling through an outdoor mall in San Diego. We had just watched a movie and were killing time while waiting for my parents to pick us up. It was late, probably sometime past 11 p.m., and the streets were quiet. We wandered close to a main road when a cop car passed us. To our surprise, the car made a sharp U-turn and headed straight for us. The officer got out and asked us how old we were and what we were doing out so late. We explained our situation, thinking that would be the end of it, but he informed us that it was past curfew and that minors weren't allowed to be outside alone at that hour. My friend and I exchanged looks, both silently screaming, "WTF?" You see, we're from Sweden, where it's completely normal for teenagers to be out at any time of day or night without issue. The officer, perhaps sensing our shock, said he was a good cop and wouldn't take us to the station but insisted we go back to the cinema to wait for our ride. The whole encounter left us baffled. We couldn't wrap our heads around the idea of a curfew for minors. It was such an alien concept to us. Story 7. We were somewhere in Oregon, and as you do, we decided to check out a massive Walmart. The ladies in our group wandered off into the store, leaving the 5 of us guys to fend for ourselves. Naturally, we thought it would be a good idea to grab a case of beer, head back to our black SUV, a giant Suburban, and hang out. After tossing the case into the vehicle, we popped open a beer each, lit some cigarettes, and started chatting and laughing. 15 minutes later, the rest of the group was still nowhere to be seen. That's when things took a turn. Out of nowhere, 3 policemen surrounded us. One of them was so tall that when I looked out the passenger window, all I could see was his belt buckle. These guys were serious. Earlier, one of us had tossed the empty bottles into a nearby bin. The police must have seen that, so when they asked if we'd been drinking, we all chorused a very synchronized and nervous no. Spoiler, they didn't buy it. They were polite but firm, explaining the laws about open containers and public drinking. After running a sobriety test on our driver, thankfully, he passed, they let us off with just a warning. It was a close call, and we learned the hard way that cracking open a beer in a parking lot, even in the middle of nowhere, isn't as chill as we thought. Story 8. This might sound silly, but when I landed at the airport, I only had $100 bills on me, courtesy of the bank where I exchanged my money. Not wanting to be rude in a foreign country, I thought the polite thing to do would be to buy something small to break the bill. So, I headed to an airport shop and bought a Coke. The cashier, a sassy woman deeply engrossed in a conversation with her friend, was not amused. She sighed dramatically, glared at me, and barked, "Next time, don't come here with no change." I was baffled. I was just trying to be polite, but apparently my $100 bill was a major inconvenience. That wasn't the only awkward encounter. While at a Walmart, I asked an employee where the toilets were. She looked at me, confused, and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am. We don't sell those here." It took me a second to realize the misunderstanding. I explained that I wasn't looking to buy a toilet, and she suggested I try Home Depot if I changed my mind. Eventually, I found the restroom, or toilet as we say back home, but not before learning the hard way that toilet is considered a bit rude in the US. My mom, horrified, gave me a crash course in American euphemisms. The ladies' room, the powder room, the restroom. You get the idea. On a lighter note, I was once complimented on my friendly attitude at a student bar in New York. Just as I was feeling pretty good about myself, someone added, "And he's Asian too." Asians are usually so quiet. It wasn't meant as an insult, but that casual, unintentional racism hit differently. It made me realize how deeply ingrained these stereotypes can be. Story 9. Late one night, I found myself at South Station in Boston, waiting for a train after my flight home had been canceled. That's where I met the unforgettable, luscious Linda. Linda, a 50-year-old former stripper, was full of stories. She proudly shared her life story, starting with her marriage at 17 to a Puerto Rican man. Her father insisted they marry after she got pregnant. It didn't end well. Her husband got her hooked on drugs, and after 12 years and 2 kids, she left him when she found out he'd been cheating with her best friend. They're still best friends, apparently. Linda's career in stripping began after that, and it came with its own set of challenges, including a couple of heart attacks. Now, she's clean, well, mostly. She only smokes weed these days. She was heading to Florida to visit her dad, who was on his 8th heart attack, and planned to make some side cash selling Molly. "You've got to do what you love," she said, shrugging. At some point, she realized I was British, which sparked a rant about the royal family. Linda adored Princess Diana and was convinced Prince Philip had her killed. She vowed to punch Prince Charles if she ever got the chance. Just when I thought I'd escaped Linda, a man stormed up, furious about missing the 4th of July due to a court date. When he yelled this at me, I tried to empathize with a casual, "That sucks, man." Bad move. He slapped me on the head and shouted, "Happy 4th of July!" Expletive. Before storming off. Between Linda and that guy, South Station was an experience. The rest of my trip to the US was fantastic, but that night at the station felt like something out of a surreal comedy. Story 10. I'm a white Canadian guy, not too different from your average American, I guess. Anyway, I was on a road trip to the Florida Keys and stopped overnight in Jacksonville. I needed to grab a pair of sandals, so I headed to this little plaza around 6 p.m. Unbeknownst to me, I had wandered straight into the hood. The only store still open was an Air Jordan shop. I figured, well, I need sandals, so why not? When I stepped inside, there were about 8 or 10 black people casually chatting. The moment I walked in, though, their conversations came to a complete stop, and they all stared at me for a solid 5 seconds. It hit me that a white Canadian guy probably wasn't their typical customer. I quickly browsed their sandals, grabbed a pair, which were pricey by the way, and decided I wasn't leaving empty-handed after that entrance. While I was at the register, a guy was talking to the cashier about his baby mama and how he needed to get away from her. At the same time, I noticed a woman buying Air Jordans for her toddler. It wasn't exactly a WTF moment, but it was definitely strange being a total minority for the first time in my life. Later, while I was in Georgia, a waitress asked, "Y'all want some grits?" I nearly laughed. It just sounded so foreign to me. Story 11. A few years ago, my husband and I were driving across Texas on our way to the Houston airport to catch a flight back to the UK. This was during a time when the speed limit was capped at 50 miles per hour. My husband, though, was pushing closer to 70 miles per hour. We were cruising down a dual carriageway when a cop car passed us going the opposite direction. I didn't say anything, assuming he saw us and didn't care. Turns out, my husband thought the same because he didn't slow down. A couple of minutes later, we saw flashing lights in the rearview mirror. In the UK, Police typically pull in front of you to signal that you need to stop, so we kept driving for a bit, confused. Eventually, we figured out how it works in the States and pulled over. The cop walked up, and my husband immediately apologized. He looked at my husband's UK driving license while we explained we were heading to the airport to fly home. Another officer joined him, and they had a whole discussion right in front of us. Apparently, they couldn't issue an on-the-spot fine, so it would have to go through a judge. But then they started talking about how the judge was out hunting for a few days and wouldn't be happy if he had to come back for a speeding case. After debating for a while, they let us off with a verbal warning and gave us a slip noting the offense. We still have that slip somewhere as a souvenir. Honestly, the whole situation boiled down to the judge was hunting. Classic Texas. Story 12. This happened a few weeks after I arrived in Seattle and started classes at Shoreline Community College in Washington. It was my first time in America, and my uncle, who had visited before, had warned me, "It's not like the movies. Don't get culture shock." One winter evening, I had a late class and had to stop at a bus interchange on my way home. While waiting, I was minding my own business, playing on my smartphone, when I heard heavy footsteps approaching. They sounded like someone wearing heels, so I expected a larger woman. Suddenly, a huge silhouette appeared and sat down beside me. A deep man's voice said, "Hi, how are you?" I mumbled, "Fine," while trying not to stare. It was my first close encounter with a transgender person, and I was so nervous that I started stuttering. He was massive, not obese, but all muscle, and dressed in a tight, colorful one-piece dress with red fishnet stockings and 8 centimeters high heels. His lipstick was a bright rose red, and he wore small green earrings. A black wig hung just past his shoulders, and the smell of freshly sprayed perfume was overwhelming. We started chatting, and I did my best to stay respectful, knowing I was in America, the land where anything can happen. Then, out of nowhere, he got excited when 2 blonde guys passed by about 20 meters away. He exclaimed how hot they were and announced he was going to chase them. As he pulled out a mirror from his handbag to check his look, the 2 guys saw what was happening and bolted like Olympic sprinters. The transgender man shouted after them, "Don't run away. Wait for me," while chasing them down. I sat there in stunned silence, feeling both relieved and overwhelmed, silently hoping we'd never cross paths again. It was a surreal and, frankly, terrifying introduction to America for me. Story 13. I'm currently spending a month traveling through the US, and last week, we visited SeaWorld San Diego. While we were at the killer whale show, something happened that absolutely caught me off guard. Before the show started, one of the trainers came on stage and asked all current and former members of the United States military to stand up and remain standing. Now, this might seem perfectly normal to you guys, but for us, it was wildly surreal. Back home, people don't really care much about the military. Sometimes they're even looked down upon. But here, an entire stadium full of strangers erupted into applause for a solid minute, all for these people they'd never even met. It was incredible to see that level of recognition and respect, and honestly, it was heartwarming. Still, it felt so alien to me, a pure, unapologetic display of patriotism you just don't encounter anywhere else. Story 14. I wouldn't necessarily call this a WTF America story, but it was definitely something that left a lasting impression on me. I've never really shared it before, so maybe now is as good a time as any. Back in 2013, the IT manager in our New York City office quit, and I was sent over to fill in until we could hire someone new. They put me up in a service department in the financial district, in a building overlooking Wall Street and right next to a church. My first night there, I decided to embrace the NYC vibe, head to a bar, tip $1 per beer just because, and maybe strike up a conversation with a stranger. Everything started off pretty standard. I can't remember the name of the pub, the bartender, or even what beer I ordered. It was all pretty unremarkable. Then, less than 1 beer in, I ordered some food, and a middle-aged woman sitting nearby started chatting with me about it. She seemed like someone just unwinding after work, and I was happy to talk. At 26, I was excited to meet new people, and she was doing most of the talking anyway. At some point, though, the conversation took a turn. She started talking about our surroundings, the city, the buildings, the skyline, and then, without warning, she opened up about her life. She told me she had lost her husband on September 11th and that her kids had been taken away because she couldn't cope after the tragedy. I was stunned.
I didn't know what to say.
It felt so raw, so deeply personal, and completely unexpected. I stayed polite, listened, and did my best to be supportive, but I felt so out of my depth. She was clearly still grieving, and in some way, it felt like I was witnessing a personification of the lingering sorrow from that event. When I finished my food, I hugged her before leaving, and she held on longer than I expected. Her look said it all. She didn't want to be alone that night. But I gently pulled away, said my goodbyes, and left the bar, never returning. That night, I walked back to my apartment feeling awful for her and shaken by the encounter. It felt like something straight out of a movie or a novel, but it was all too real.